So do you know where the first place in the world was to introduce a minimum wage? Well, to tell that story, we have to begin in the late 19th century, where unions in Australia were involved in a big public debate against conservative forces. You probably know the types, some of those big businesses and the right-wing politicians. And they were arguing that it was the market that should decide the value and conditions of labour. What this meant was that they thought that employers should basically just be paid whatever employers said that they could afford to pay. But we saw things a bit differently. We argued that working people aren't just workers. We're not commodities. We're also people. So economic rights are human rights. The right to live decently in a society that we, as workers, have built and keep running. Then something pretty incredible happens. From 1882 to 1883, women textile workers in Victoria went on strike after an employer tried to reduce their pay. This strike ended as a massive victory for these workers, who won their logger claims and formed a new union, called the Tayloresses Union. But a strike also showed just how horrible the wages and conditions in factories were, and public outrage led to a royal commission being held. The commission found many persons are unable to earn more than a bare subsistence, even though they labour 14 and 16 hours a day. And the commission made a number of recommendations that were ultimately passed into law by the government of Alfred Deakin, who was a progressive politician at the time. This law was known as the Factories and Shops Act, and it implemented some of the first workplace health and safety laws in Victoria. But that didn't stop the debate over the rights and conditions of labour. So in 1895, a new debate broke out over the Factories Act, where progressive politicians, including former union leaders who'd been elected to Parliament, argued that human rights included economic rights. And so they moved to amend the Factories Act to create wage boards that would determine minimum rates of pay, especially for the most disadvantaged workers. Then, two trade union-backed MPs moved that minimum rates should actually apply not just to the most vulnerable, but to all workers. This motion passed, and it implemented the first legal compulsory minimum wage anywhere in the world, right here in Australia in 1896. And as the historian Marilyn Lake has shown, this was a huge deal. People all around the world were talking about this and how amazing it was. And for comparison's sake, Britain's minimum wage wasn't introduced until 1999, more than a century after we pioneered the idea. In 1904, the new Commonwealth government passed a law that was strongly backed by unions and created a system of arbitration. This was a court that would oversee industrial disputes. The first president of this court was a judge called Henry Bournes Higgins, and he'd actually been an MP in Victoria who'd voted for the minimum wage in 1895. Higgins oversaw a case in 1907 that came to be known as the Sunshine Harvester case. Alfred Deakin had become Prime Minister after Federation, and he introduced a law that made employers exempt from a tax if they paid fair and reasonable wages. The owner of the Sunshine Harvester factory, which built combine harvesters in the suburb of Sunshine, applied for this exemption. The union representing its workers said, "Hang on a second, you don't pay fair and reasonable wages." And because of this challenge, the case came before Higgins at the arbitration court. Now, Higgins decided that a fair and reasonable wage should be based on more than what an employer claimed that they could afford. He ruled that there should be a basic wage, which should take into account the cost of living in society and how much a worker requires to take care of their family. This created a minimum rate of pay that prevented a race to the bottom on wages. As Higgins explained, if your business model doesn't include paying your workers appropriate wages, you shouldn't be in business. It effectively took the Victorian minimum wage to the national level. This famous decision helped to frame Australian industrial relations for decades to come. Now, sadly today, some conservative politicians and some employer groups are repeating those arguments from the 19th century. So it's more important than ever that everyone who believes that workers should have the right to live a decent life with a decent wage to get involved with their union.